Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Marche, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. And before we get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we're excited to have you here today for our presentation. I want to remind you that attendees are muted, but if you have a question, please feel free to use the chat function and our presenters will go ahead and address those before or after the webinar today as appropriate. Also, if we don't have time to get to your question, go ahead and leave your phone number as well, and we will make sure someone reaches out to you after today's event. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. Well, I'd love to introduce you to today's moderator. Let me get his picture up here. Let me go ahead and get his bio up here on my screen again so I can read it to you. Eric Boehm is a partner and co-founder of Stonebridge Asset Management. He brings international and institutional investment perspectives to the team, having begun his financial career in the Czech Republic, working for both a local bank and an emerging equity fund. Eric holds degrees from New York University's Stern School of Business, Johns Hopkins SAIS, and Georgetown University. He obtained the Chartered Financial Analyst designation in 2002 and the Certified Kingdom Advisor designation in 2007. He and his wife have 2 children and reside in Signal Mountain, Tennessee. On his off hours, he can be found spending time with his family, playing soccer, pursuing spiritual growth with like-minded Christian men, and leading mission trips to the Czech Republic. And I'd love to introduce you to our speaker. We're so excited to have her back. She previously was here in a webinar talking about transitioning to college for the neurodiverse student. And we're just really excited to have her present again today. Stephanie Martin is the president of College Living Experience and has spent her career working with students with varying disabilities of all ages. Being an educator first and foremost, Stephanie brings her unique perspective and unwavering passion of supporting the special education community through the innovative services of CLE. Stephanie focuses on co-creating an environment where students have maximized opportunity to be their own self-determined advocates with the necessary skills to be successful. And Stephanie, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share here and turn the time over to you.
Fantastic. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks, Marche and Advice Chaser for having me back. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about executive functions and the role that they play throughout our lives. Again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat and we'll try and answer them as we go. If not, we'll hold off and answer them at the end. So, do you ever think any of these things? Is my child smart, scattered, and endeavoring to succeed? Is my son disorganized, or does he procrastinate to get a task started? Is my daughter late or consistently forgetting her homework? Is my child impulsive and makes poor decisions? How much of this feels familiar to you? Is it something that you are experiencing with your own children? Is it something that you experience yourself? Is it something that you witness possibly on a daily basis in your home environment, possibly your work environment, and maybe with your own kids or your clients or students or anything like that? So please know that in some aspects, we are all affected and impacted by executive functions and dysfunctions. And so we're going to go through this a little bit. Our goal for today, though, is really to demonstrate a basic understanding for all of you of what executive functions are. We're going to help build a toolbox full of tips, strategies, techniques to support you and your child, and implement strategies to address deficits as well as strengths. So what is an executive function and what are they? The executive functions are skills, are a set of processes that have to do with managing oneself and one's resources in order to achieve a goal. It's an umbrella term for the neurologically based skills involving mental control and self-regulation. It's a lot of words, but basically it's, and what it really means is it's all the stuff that helps us manage ourselves on a daily basis. It's everything from time management to prioritization, task initiation, organization. Do you have systems in your own environment? Do you not? Do you try to remember everything or do you write it down? All of those kinds of things are wrapped up in executive functions.
Stephanie, you mentioned that earlier that we all have executive function deficits in some way. And so what you just now said sounds like it could apply to all of us, adults,
Absolutely.
children, whatever. So
absolutely. And one thing I didn't include in this particular webinar, but happy to do so if somebody is looking to figure out where their strengths and their weaknesses fall in terms of executive functions, just reach out to me at the end. I'll give you my email address and I'll be happy to send you a self-assessment. You can have a self-assessment and then there's one for adults and there's one for children. And so if you have a child or somebody that you would like to have a better understanding, please know it's a self-rated assessment. And so it's not necessarily normed or is not necessarily going to be something that you can share with medical professionals, but it's going to give you a basic understanding of where some of the strengths and the deficits lie. It's really, really helpful.
good to know.
So when and how do they develop? Executive functions develop through childhood and into young adulthood. The development of executive functions is related to brain development and experience. And I think this is really important for everybody to recognize is that everyone's skill sets develop at a different rate. And so that's going to be based a little bit just on the physiological aspect of the brain. But the more that we can provide experience for ourselves or anybody else, the greater opportunity that we have to increase their actual rate of skill acquisition. So remember that sometimes we want to shelter ourselves or even others from failure, but failure is a great teacher. And it gives people the time and the exposure to understand what worked, what didn't work, and how they could do it differently the next time. Okay. So similar to other developmental skills, there is variability in the typical pattern and timeline. It looks like we have a couple people in the chat. Don't know.
Yeah, a number of people asking for the self-assessment is what they're
okay.
what they would love.
We'll hold on to that and we'll get that to you. So what can you expect in executive functionings for young children in preschool? I'm sure this is no surprise to anybody, but they live in the moment and they want immediate gratification. They can delay for a few minutes by the age of 2 or 3, but that's not going to be a huge amount of time. Okay. They work for a simple goal, but become easily distracted. In some instances, they begin to learn basic emotional regulation. So for example, basic emotional regulation at this age would be that another child comes and takes their toy. And so instead of lashing out and grabbing it back or having a tantrum, they're able to kind of accept the situation for what it is and go to the next toy. So key executive functioning tasks for preschool age children, they can run simple one-step errands or tasks. For example, they can tidy their bedroom or the playroom. They perform simple self-help tasks such as brushing their teeth, getting dressed, and they can inhibit behaviors, for example, not grabbing a toy from another child. EF skills or executive functioning skills are more strongly associated with school readiness than IQ or entry-level math or reading. So it's really important to pay attention to all of these as we go through them And the self-assessment might be helpful, especially if you have young children who have not started preschool yet. So what do we see in executive functionings with elementary school children? They're still focused in the here and now, but their working memory continues to develop. So at this point, that means that they can follow 2- and 3-step directions. There's a steady development of planning, organizational, and self-monitoring skills occurs. And we can talk a little bit about that, but it's really helpful and beneficial for everybody to start some kinds of systems in elementary school. And if you don't want to use the word system, think about the concept of a routine. So what is the bedtime routine? What is the morning routine? What is the after school routine? And then it becomes just that. It becomes routine and muscle memory, and it doesn't have to become something that's quite so effortful for an individual to think through, because it's just an automatic reflex. Okay. They can start to think more flexibly about problem solving. Again, recognize the opportunity of providing the value of giving somebody the opportunity to think through a situation. And even if the decision they make is not the right one, that's a teaching opportunity in and of itself. So don't try to avoid problem solving or critically thinking for your children, but give them the opportunity to do it on their own. That means you, as parents or providers or teachers, have to allow yourselves time for that to take place. We often run out of time, and that's exactly when we as parents step in and say, oh, forget it. I'm just going to tie your shoe. We got to go. Right. But making sure that you are clearly articulating and setting aside enough time for these skills to develop is going to be key. So some things that they can do: they can run more complex errands. For example, they can complete chores with reminders. They can decide how to spend their allowance. They can plan simple projects such as book reports, and they can start to inhibit behavior. So instead of misbehaving when the teacher is out of the room, they actually manage their behavior and not misbehave. So those are a couple things that you can expect in elementary school. In middle school, middle school is difficult for everybody. So they can independently manage the daily routine at home and at school, typically by age or 11 or 12. They can start to use more advanced goal setting and flexibility. They can continue to develop impulse control and task management skills. However, please note that in middle school, this is the biggest time in which you start to see the brain start to develop at a faster rate, and impulse control and self-management is incredibly difficult for individuals between the ages of really 10 to 15. So knowing that is going to be helpful for you in terms of how you're going to work with your child or with your student. School demands increase as executive functioning improves. So many kids need help during this transition. Okay. So middle school is at the start where there's more and more required in terms of academics. And then that you add in any of the after school activities, and you add all of this stuff in, and the day-to-day is so regulated that there's not enough downtime. And so making sure that you can pepper that in is going to be important as well, so that they can start to learn how to manage and monitor some of their own behavior. So key things to work on here is use a system for organizing schoolwork. That can be a computer calendar. It can be a day planner. It could be something that's written that the school gives them. But the more you use it now, the more independent they can become with it through high school. And the huge point of this is that many children who transition from middle school to high school and don't have an organizational system are those that really, really struggle in college, because they have no means or ways to manage everything that's in front of them, because everything was done for them in middle school and high school. So really start working on some kind of succinct and specific system that can be checked and monitored regularly. They will follow complex school schedules. They can carry out long-term projects. They inhibit rule breaking in absence of visible authority.
Is there any way you could describe, say, a system?
Sure.
I've got ideas like, does that mean like having a calendar book or something
It
like
does.
that? Is that kind of stuff you're talking about?
Yeah, it could be a calendar book that's every day, every
Mhm.
page is every day. It could be a calendar book where 2 pages is a full week. It could be that you have just a calendar, a legit just
Right.
monthly calendar, and you write things in there. It could be not my favorite, but this is not my favorite. It could be for somebody else is Post-it notes. Lots of people do really well with just posting things up, and then when they're finished, they just take them down and they toss them in the garbage. It's whatever is going to work for that individual. But it's really important to know that one system isn't going to work forever.
Right, right.
And there's typically a transition and a trial and error kind of thing that happens. Like, I'll try this one. Oh, it didn't really work. I'll try this one. It didn't really work. And then sometimes you end up having somewhat of a hybrid, right? Where you use part of a computer calendar and part of a written system. And then that way you've kind of got a balance or a backup one for the other. So really trial and error is going to be huge, especially as it relates to the middle school student. And then in high school, independent planning and organization is fine-tuned. Some executive functioning skills become more automatic and require less effort. Again, anything that you can start to develop a routine for will then require less effort over time. Social relationships are particularly important. So teens may show better impulse control and planning in social arenas rather than academics. I think this is really important, you guys, hear that even though they are developing better impulse control, it doesn't mean that the environment is matching that. It's not like there's a decrease in stimuli in high school that says, okay, I'm going to have better control over this. Actually, what happens is the stimuli in high school just increases exponentially. And so while an individual may have better better impulse control, overall, there's just so many more things that are coming to them that they cannot resist everything in front of them. So be mindful of that. Key tasks would be to manage schoolwork without supervision, establish and refine long-term goals, manage leisure time. Huge, folks. That's so huge. And when we talk about managing leisure time, what does that look like for the average individual in middle school or high school? Does that mean that they're on some kind of screen? Are they in front of a television? Are they in front of a computer? Are they in front of an iPad or a phone? What are they doing? Because that's not really leisure time. That's passive engagement in something. Passive entertainment is what it is. And so what does leisure time look like? Does it look like they have a hobby, that they are participating in a sport, that they actually get up and leave the house and interact with somebody in person? What does leisure time really look like? Do they read a book? Are they in the theater and the arts? It isn't an overall, like everybody has to have something, but really pay attention to how you define leisure time and what that looks like. There's work, they can manage their work schedule and recreational activities, as well as learn to inhibit reckless and dangerous behavior. Okay, so I love this. I'm going to let us sit with this a little bit. What you can see here are really 9 graphs, and each graph you'll see the performance on the left side as well as the age across the bottom. And so what you can see here, let's take a look at cognitive flexibility, which is the second graph from the top on the left side. You can see that by the age of 18 or 20, an individual has really hit their peak in terms of their cognitive flexibility. So when we're asking somebody to be flexible and they're only 4 and 5 years old, we're just setting ourselves up for failure as well as the individual, because they just have not developed that skill set yet, right? So really understanding how these all play a different role in the development of an individual over time, I think is really important. So look at
Can
goal
you,
setting and
before you jump on, can you
Mhm.
just give an example of cognitive flexibility? We have a question to give, maybe expound a little bit on that.
It's your ability to shift. It's a mind shift. So if you're really focused in something like, for example, this is a good one for people in work, right? You've got a project, you're working on it really well. Somebody comes and knocks on your door, right? And says, do you have a minute? And you go, okay. And they come in and you shift, you're cognitively flexible enough to shift the focus from your project to what somebody brought to you. And you're able to answer that, right? But then the real test is not the answering of the question that the person brought to you, is how quickly can you shift back, and are you flexible enough to go back to the project that you were working on? And I don't have the data in front of me, but there are studies out there that say that for every interruption that you experience, it takes between, like, I'm going to guess on this, between 3 to 9 minutes to re-engage in what you were initially working on. So you can see why this is so important in terms of, and when you're able to kind of manage all of this together. I think what we'll do is just go to look at the main graph here on the right side, and you can see blue. The blue line is impulse control, and the red line is sensation seeking. And you can see by the time that somebody's 24, 25, they're managing their impulsivity pretty well, right? And also by the time that they're that same age, they're not really seeking a whole bunch of stuff that's going to get the brain going really fast. And so that's at the point where the discrepancy is in the area that you want it. But if you look at somebody who's 14 and 15, their impulse control is at a minus 0.1, and their sensation seeking is already up at 0.15. And so the discrepancy between those two is so big. And that's the reason why we see individuals in their teenage years making poor decisions, is because they're not in alignment with each other in terms of the development, their cognitive development. So in young adulthood, what do we see? We see improved judgment, decision-making skills, and planning. This is important because it allows for pursuing further education, starting a career, developing intimate relationship, and assuming other responsibilities. So what do we know about executive functionings in the brain? The brain develops through rapid growth of the neurons, creation of neural connections and pruning, gradual reduction in total number of neurons as pathways become more efficient. The brain develops from the front to the back. So it develops from down here and all the way up to the front. The prefrontal cortex is the predominant area in which all of the executive functions are housed. So it makes total sense that if this is the last thing to develop, it makes sense why it takes so long for the average individual to actually develop most of the skills that are executive functions. So it does involve multiple systems. So the frontal lobe is also important, our connections with subcortical brain regions and other regions of the cortex. So this is just important for you to know. Now, the one thing that I didn't speak about necessarily is that at the age of 23, 24, that's the average age that somebody's prefrontal cortex is well developed, and they've developed the skills, the executive functioning skills that they are going to have. Again, the more experience they have, the more they're exposed, the better that those skills are going to be. If you have if you are working in the field, or you have a child that's neurodiverse, add between 3 to 5 years to that 23, 24 years old, because it's a slower process. And so somebody could be close to 30 years old before they've actually had enough experience and that part of the brain is well formed enough. So next. So the frontal lobes, they direct our behavior. They help us decide what to pay attention to and what actions to take. They link our behaviors with past experience. They help us control our emotions and our behaviors. They observe, assess, and fine-tune, allowing us to correct and choose a new strategy. Frontal lobes and frontal systems are sensitive to early brain injury. So executive dysfunction is commonly reported in a variety of conditions that affect brain development, such as traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, and/or cancer. Those are just a few examples. However, deficits may not be apparent until middle school or high school when demands increase. There really are 12 different executive functions, but we're really going to only focus in on 5 today. If you are interested in the presentation that has outlined all 12, just let me know. I'm happy to send it to Marche or happy to send it to anybody who's looking for additional resources. So the first that we're going to talk about is response inhibition. What is it? It's the capacity to think before you act. And more importantly, the ability to resist the urge to say or do something. My mom always says, if it feels good to say it, you probably shouldn't. So don't say it at all. That's a nice, just kind of general way to think about it. But really, it is the ability to resist the urge to say or do something. So what can we do to help address some of the response inhibition? So create an environment where self-control is consistently rewarded. And you want to reward the effort for control, not just the fact that they controlled themselves, but you could tell that they were really trying. I think that that's important to note. Support young children with timely reminders. Think about reminders as in 2 different ways. There are direct prompts and indirect prompts. And as a child ages up, you want to shift from direct to indirect. A direct prompt is, it's time to get up, brush your teeth. An indirect prompt is, wow, what time is it? And what do you think you need to do first? Because when you ask or prompt with indirect prompts, you're actually providing an opportunity for the individual to critically think and problem solve. So even just that one strategy, if you do that in your daily life with anybody, then you're creating an opportunity for critical thinking and problem solving. Play games that help kids practice self-control. Give kids a break. And the break doesn't have to be 45 minutes. Sometimes the break is just a 2 or 3 minute break from whatever is happening, especially if it's requiring them to manage their behavior. And when you give them a break, you remove them from that environment or the temptation that's in front of them. And you can talk to them about what it is they're feeling and help give them some guidance. So then they go back into that environment, they're better suited and and they're more capable of managing their behavior and not losing control. And losing control is just in quotations. Turn have to tasks into want to tasks. This is really addressing motivation. So always think about anything that you do in terms of teaching in 2 different ways. If an individual isn't doing, is it because it's a can't do or a won't do? If it's a can't do, is that they don't have the skill sets to do it on their own. So that means you need to teach them. You need to model for them. You need to instruct the process. If it's a won't do, that means that it has to do with motivation. And so you're going to have to address what is motivating about that, what's not motivating, what would they work for? Do you need a reinforcement system? Could you make it fun? So instead of let's talk about ourselves as adults. Maybe exercise is not your bag, right? But you know, exercise is going to be healthy for you in the long run. And everybody feels like exercise is a have to. If you change the conditions of exercise to be doing it with somebody that you don't get to see very often, but you see them every time you exercise and you make it an exercise date, that changes the environmental conditions in such a way that it becomes a want to task, not a have to. So it doesn't have to be overly complicated. You just need to think through it. And then instill the right mindset for tackling challenges and learning from failure. There's a great book out there by Carol Dweck. It's called Mindset. And there's a huge chapter for parents and teachers and coaches on how to address effort versus perfection and being the best at something, and how we as Americans and many cultures really reinforce the end of it all. Like, oh, you got straight A's, fantastic. Whereas is that really what matters, or is it really about the effort that they put into it and the process? And so if you're looking for something about mindset, it's a great book and I highly recommend it.
And that
So
that'll be on the end, you have a list of books. I believe that we have that on the presentation.
we do,
listed there.
absolutely. So working memory is really important because it's the ability to hold information in memory while performing complex tasks. It's the ability to draw on past learning experience and apply it to current situation or to the future. It's important. Did I make a mistake before? If I did, do I remember it? Do I remember the outcome? And will that prevent me from making the same decision this time so that I'm not ending up in the same spot? Okay, that's a pretty basic analogy. But here are some strategies and interventions. Work on visualization skills. There's a lot of ways to recall information by visualizing it rather than it just being auditory. The best teachers are those that allow somebody else to teach them. So have your child teach you something that you taught them. This is a great way to check for comprehension and to check exactly what they understand and where the gaps might be. If we're only talking about kids and you're thinking, wow, this doesn't really apply to me because I'm in the work setting, same concept.
Yeah, right.
If you have an employee or your supervisor and you're really, you want an employee to do something new in their repertoire, teach them and then have them teach you back or have you watch them teach somebody else so that you're checking for comprehension and the entire sequence of what that looks like. Suggest games that use visual memory. Some more complicated one simple example would be the old card game concentration. You could do charades. There's a lot of different things that can work on visual memory. Play cards. Encourage active reading. So that means that it's not just reading to yourself, but you're reading back and forth. Chunk information into smaller bites so that it's far easier to recall. Make things multisensory. So we all have our own primary domain learning modality. Some people are visual, some are auditory, some are kinesthetic, some are all of it. But more often than not, when you can make it multisensory, you're going to hit at least one of those that is relevant to the individual who's learning. So make sure that you can make it as multisensory as possible, and then help make connections. Help make connections not only with other people, but make connections between, oh, do you remember when you did this? What happened? When you decided to ride your friend on the back of your bicycle and you both didn't have helmets, what happened? Something like that, all right? Those is just a simple example. Emotional control. The definition is ability to manage emotions to achieve goals, complex tasks, or direct behavior. The influence we exert on our emotions, thoughts, and behavior. So how much emotional control do we have over ourselves? How aware are we? First and foremost is important too. Because if we're not very self-aware, then having emotional control is going to be that much more difficult. So if you're working with young, and you can work with anybody, and ask questions that help guide them towards their own self-awareness. So for little ones, you can ask, well, how did that make you feel? What were you doing in the situation, right? There's a lot of different techniques, especially with occupational therapy and speech therapy too, that for little ones, that really help them understand what they're doing in that moment. But then just continue to ask them questions that aren't closed-ended, but open-ended, especially if you start the question with what, not what did you do and why did you do it, but what led you to that decision? What happened after that decision? What would you do differently next time? So again, every question that I'm asking is prompting critical thinking and problem solving. Interventions and strategies for emotional control. Teach coping strategies. So if somebody's really heightened and stressed out, what are some coping strategies that might work for them? It could be the basics of taking a walk, removing themselves from the environment. It could be counting to 10. It could be using the alphabet. You could do anything. I worked with a student of mine about a year ago, and she was really incredibly upset regarding the fact that she couldn't access the link to her college class. And she was really, really upset. And so she got really up, and I gave her all of these ideas, like, why don't you take a deep breath? How about take a walk? And she finally calmed down. And when I talked to her, I said, did any of those things help? And she said, no. I said, really? And she goes, yeah, they didn't redirect my mind. I said, what would allow you to help? And she goes, could you just let me cry a little bit? I said, so your coping mechanism is to cry. And she goes, yeah, then I'll be done with it. And I said, okay. And I said, but in the meantime, what if somebody else doesn't know you? What should they say? And she goes, I don't know. And I said, did you know that there's a military alphabet? And she went, what? And I said, how about we learn the military alphabet? And when you're really stressed out, you go through that. And she goes, I would be happy to do that. And so sometimes it's the basic stuff that doesn't feel like it's very approachable for some, especially individuals who have been faced with a lot over the course of their lives. And sometimes when something's new or novel, they're a little bit more willing to accept it. So something to think about there. A fidget toy or a squeeze ball or something like that is always going to be good. It kind of grounds them and brings them back to the moment. Exercise, make it fun. I think positive, use affirmations. Listen to music and be a good role model. The other thing I think that's really important is mindfulness. And so if anybody has any mindfulness practices that they engage in, teaching somebody else how to do that is really important. And that just basically means teaching somebody to be very present in what they're doing at that given moment. It could be as simple as having somebody sit in a comfortable position and have them go through each part of their body. Where are your feet? Are they, where are they located? How do you feel? All those kinds of things. I'm doing a terrible job of giving you the example, but mindfulness is something that can work. And so cognitive flexibility, the ability to revise plans in the face of obstacles, setbacks, new information, or mistakes, relates to adaptability to changing conditions. This is the example that I gave about the worker. So here are some things about cognitive flexibility. Develop problem-solving systems. Use a chart. Think aloud. Use explicit teacher modeling. Ask clarifying questions. And I think there's one more to this. No. So again, cognitive flexibility is initially you start with a system, you start with routines and all of those kinds of things. But at some point, you want to be able to put in a little bit of a bump in the road in a system so that you can start to teach flexibility and cognitive flexibility and their ability to respond and not go, oh my God, I can't do this. That's not what we planned for today. And like, nope, it's not what we planned for today. So with little ones, you might have a visual schedule, right? It's breakfast, school, I don't know, grandparents, whatever it is. And if that's the schedule that they get used to, then change out one of the pictures to be just a symbol of surprise. And so you don't tell them what that surprise is, but then when they actually look at the schedule and they go, what is it? I'm like, well, we're going to go do it. And so that's an example of how you could do it with some little ones. I think as adults in our workforce, we're pretty much peppered throughout the day with surprises. And so if this is something that is difficult for you, develop a problem-solving system, is that something that I need to address right this minute? If the answer is no, then what is your response? Then I'm going to tell them I'll get back to them at this particular time. If the answer is yes, then you're going to address that. But what does that mean in terms of everything else that you had already scheduled for? So making sure that you are able to address what's in front of you, but not lose track of everything else that was already on your schedule. Okay. And then stress tolerance is the ability to thrive in stressful situations and to cope with uncertainty, change, and performance demands. And the ability to do the task appropriately with minimal anxiety. This is, I think, super applicable for everybody. There are a couple different things that you can do. One is to avoid stressful situations. I think that's nearly impossible. You can't avoid every stressful situation. But if there are certain things that you know are going to be triggers for you, for example, going to a party with more than 20 people is really triggering for you, then you might be able to say, no, I'm not going to do that. You might then respond with, but I'm happy to meet you individually, or I'd like to get together with you in a different context, whatever it is. It's so important to match your environment, your work environment with stress tolerance. If you have a very fast-paced job that requires you to have cognitive flexibility and have working memory and to apply all of these things at a very quick pace, and there's also performance demands on top of it, and that is not something that you can manage, then maybe that's not the work environment for you. It's important before you take a job to consider all of those things to see if they match up and line up with what you do and how you can handle them. A couple other things to think about would be mediation. Simple concept, not as easy to do, but learn to say no. Mental rehearsal in advance. So I'm, that I think is like, if this happens, then I will. If I'm approached by this particular person, I will say this. You can practice with somebody at home or somebody you feel comfortable with. Break your tasks into smaller bits. Maybe you take a break.
Can I ask you to jump back to mediation? What? Oh, I see it. Meditation. Okay.
Meditation.
I was reading mediation. And
I probably said mediation, but meditation. It's
Okay.
very simple, similar to mindfulness.
Got it.
Intersperse low stress tasks with high stress tasks. So what that means is do something that you prefer and you enjoy, and then follow it by something that may be higher stress, and then follow it back up with something that you like. This isn't necessarily a stress, well, it could be a stress situation, but if you're not really fond of cleaning your house, right, it increases your stress for some reason. Pick something that you do like to do, followed by something that you don't like to do, followed by something you do like to do, and end there. So you're ending on a positive note. It's the momentum theory is really what it is. And when you successfully complete a single task, you are more likely to go on to the second task than you were before. So that's part of the reason why you want to intersperse low and high stress task, or preferred and non-preferred things. Any of that interspersal is a really helpful tool in many, many different situations. And then build in recovery time. If you do say, if you're invited for work to that party that has more than 20 people, make sure that you set yourself up for success. You're going to go, and I'm going to go for 10, 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to go home, and I'm going to make sure there's nothing else on my plate, and I'm just going to recover. So a lot of this has to do with planning in advance, but really being aware of exactly what the environment is going to do in terms of providing you with stimuli that you may not be able to handle. And so what can you do right now? And this is for little kids, it's for anybody. Stop being the alarm system. Stop being the alarm system for your family members, for your kid, for your students, for your employees. Insist on an organizational system along with a time management system. The earlier this is introduced, the better. Increase responsibilities at home. Allow for natural consequences. And help children and or young adults or anybody fend for themselves. This is an example of making their own appointments, but taking responsibility and owning what part of that is theirs is going to be important. It gives them an opportunity to learn. It gives them an opportunity to own the success if it happens correctly, and to modify the behavior if it doesn't happen correctly. So again, these are all of the things that you can do right now as it relates to executive functions. I believe that is our last slide, but I want to briefly touch base on some books that might be good resources. Smart but Scattered by Peg Dawson. Last, Lost, and Unprepared by Jose Cooper Kahn and Lori Dietzel. Executive Functions in the Classroom. Your Fantastic Elastic Brain by Joanna Deek. The Best Me I Can Be series by Julia Cook. The Executive Functioning Workbook for Teens by Sharon Hansen, and then Mindset by Carol S. Dweck. I'm going to stop sharing now and then be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, and while we're waiting, I'll go ahead and toss out a question. Maybe it can stimulate some of the listeners to some questions as well. But what is the best way to introduce these concepts to a teenager? Is it, and I guess a sub question would be, are they more likely to accept, you know, a discussion about this if they know that there's a goal of building their emotional skills or not?
Well,
let's start with the first
question. It's a difficult question. I think that it depends on the student and the individual and the relationship that you have. In some instances, it's pretty easy to approach somebody by just saying, hey, let's talk about some things that we all are faced with every single day, every single one of us. And I want you on a scale of 1 to 10, rate how well you think you do. And then go through several of these. So I wouldn't use the words like response inhibition or anything like that. I would say, how organized do you think you are on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super organized and 1 not being organized at all. And then what that does is it gives them a voice and an active participant. They're actively playing a role in the conversation instead of it just being shoved at them. And they say, oh, okay. And like, well, when you have a project that you really like, how likely are you to start it right away? 1 to 10. And that would be task initiation. And that's an executive function. Once you start, how likely are you to finish it? And that's perseverance. When you start something, do you know how long it's going to take you on a scale of 1 to 10? Do you finish in the time that you think it's going to take? Or do you tend to finish faster or tend to finish long, it takes you longer? And that's about time management. So there's ways to approach this and that doesn't feel like it's a lecture. And what you want to do is and you can also do the self-eval. It's really, it's super simple. Parents can do it with their for themselves and then have their child do it. And then what you want to do is compare back and forth, because the last thing that you want to do is have a parent who has a weakness in a particular skill area try to teach their child how to manage the same weakness that they have. What you want to do is, if you know you have a weakness, let's just say in time management, that you are always off on how long it takes you to get someplace, then you want to have somebody who's really good at it teach either you or your child how they manage it so that they can learn from the best and what strategies they take. But again, that's how I might approach it, is really just start with a basic set of questions. And then I would include myself in the conversation. Like, I know I'm really not great at this. And how do I know that? What do I do? How do I offset it? What are the strategies that I use? Things like that. That might be one way to approach it.
Sure. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I find myself that when people start talking about themselves, it's a lot easier for me to talk about myself as well. That's helpful.
Absolutely.
And good that you mentioned the concept of, parents often have the same weakness that their children have, because the child doesn't see it modeled in the parent. So that was a good example as well. The question just came in. What about getting help for both my son and myself at the same time? So again, referring to that idea of a parent having the same weakness as the child, to go seek some joint help on that. Is that advised?
Probably not a bad idea. I'm happy to send you the eval. There are a lot of people out there that are executive function coaches. A lot of it can be done virtually, and so you don't necessarily need to be receiving the support in person. But there are a lot of folks out there that could possibly support you in doing that. I think getting a better understanding exactly of what weakness it is, and then looking at some of the resources on the last page here might be helpful as well. To just try a little bit on your own. In the meantime, start looking for executive function coaches is not a bad idea.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, one listener says you can give the child then an opportunity to teach the parent.
Absolutely.
The child has learned from the coach. Yeah, that's great. What about when, oftentimes when you have two people in a situation, one of them, may want to go, I'm going to use a different situation, may want to go to counseling. The other one may not. If you're dealing with your child, what if a child doesn't really care about improving a certain area, or doesn't believe that there's really an issue, or they don't care if they fail a class? It's not really a big deal. How would you address that type of a situation?
That's a tough one. I think part of it has to do with the developmental, the cognitive ability and where they are in terms of their own development. Sometimes that's just a sheer fact or result of what their age is. And so time might be helpful.
Mhm.
I think trying to understand what is motivating and what is a priority for them, and then how do you build that into those priorities? Often as instructors, parents, or teachers, we assume that the students have the same goals that we do, especially as parents. Like, no, you want to do that. Like, and the kid's like, no, I have no interest in that whatsoever. And so if we're enacting our will on them and they're saying, no, thank you, maybe it's not an issue about them. Maybe it's really an issue about us and how we're approaching it. So what do we want to do differently? What can we do differently? What approach do we want to take that's different? Not to assume that the student has no motivation, but they might just not have any motivation for what's important to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
I believe that's all the time we have for questions. I wanted to thank everyone for being here. Eric, thank you for being a great moderator.
Yeah.
Stephanie, we're so pleased to have you back. And I want to tell our listeners that if you're interested in learning some more from Stephanie, she gave another webinar with us, and we have that on our website under the recorded webinar section. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end things out here just a second. Let me get the right screen on the page. Whoops. Here we go. Just wanted to show Stephanie. Stephanie, you wanted to get your contact information.
Sure. If you want to reach me, my email address is smartin, SMARTIN, at experience, EXPERIENCECLE.com. So experiencecle.com.
And then, of course, Advice Chaser has your information. So if you need to reach out to Advice Chaser, we're happy to give it as well. Well, on behalf of Advice Chaser, thank you so much again for coming. Thank you to our organizations that have made this possible. We want to remind you that here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners is committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much. We'll see you at another webinar soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.